My name's Dr. Nigel Lester. For those of you who are not PALM members, I am, and don't know me, I'm the director of the mental health program at PALM, and I'm a psychiatrist of some 30 years practice. The title of our little webinar today is The Secrets of Stress Management, which hopefully sounds suitably intriguing. So now that I've got your attention, the secrets of stress management, I'm going to give you the answer to what are the secrets of stress management. So, well, this is what these are my secrets of stress management. So the first being that you may find it surprising to hear from a psychiatrist who's a doctor who specializes in the mind, but you really have to start with the body. We'll explore during this next 45 minutes why that is so, but really the stress response is first and foremost a physiological response, and our emotional responses to it are closer to our body than they are to our cognitive or higher brain. And so whenever we're in a state of stress, it is really key to start with calming the body and accessing your calming abilities through the body. Second secret of stress management may not seem quite so revealing, but knowledge is key. But the point about that is that we often think that we've already figured out what the problem is, and straight away we're onto a solution without really taking the time to educate ourselves about what the major components of the situation are. And the major components in any state of stress or stressful part of life are going to be two, right? They're going to be you and the situation you find yourself in. And hopefully by the end of this little talk, I will have informed you and inspired you enough to realize that there's more to learn about you. And then the third secret of stress management is that small changes build big benefits. This may not be, again, such a big secret, but it is something that somehow we all struggle with. You know, it's very common as a psychiatrist to have a patient who's waited a long time to come see me, and they'll come into my office and they've got, you know, they've been preparing for what they want to tell me, and they are hoping that having told me their story, you know, that I will come out with some amazing bon mot or words of wisdom, and there will be this massive epiphany, and the roof will be blown off my office, and the trumpets will blare, and everything will change. And of course, you know, that's not actually how life works. You wouldn't walk into a gym and pick up the largest weight in the room, and if you couldn't lift it, walk out again convinced that you'll never get stronger. No, you'd find an appropriate size weight, you'd have a little go on that, you'd come back the next day, have another little go. And so it is with anything we do in terms of making changes in our lifestyle and changes in our habits. We have to learn to value the small things. We have to learn to recognize that when we consider some things more important than the other, that kind of value judgment is often very ill-informed. You know, how do we know what really matters? You know, we need to start to look with a slightly more open mind at the things that matter in our lives and the things that we can change and make a difference in. And it's those small changes that build big benefits. I'm sure, like any other doctor, if I'd thought about all the things I was going to have to do on the first day that I entered medical school, I would have turned around and walked out and done something easier. But you just start with the small things. You buy the first book, you know, you read the first chapter, and so on. And next thing you know, you're giving a webinar on stress management. Okay, let's step back a moment, though, and understand, what are we talking about when we're talking about stress? Well, you know, my favorite topic, for those of you who've heard me talk before will know that I talk a lot about the emotional brain and our so-called fight or flight response, which is our response to real or perceived danger resulting in physiological change. So this is a remarkable part of our neurophysiology. It has stood us in fantastic stead over the millennia of human evolution, because it has allowed us to develop quick schemas to respond to any number of stimuli that might suggest a danger. We don't have to get the whole picture. We don't have to analyze what's going on. We don't have to think about it or discuss it. We just respond. Now, that served us extremely well in the days when we were wandering around the jungle and everything was pretty much as it always was every day. We lived and died amongst the same 25 happy faces of our clan. And if we saw a strange face, or if we heard a strange noise, or if we saw something move that shouldn't move, there was an immediate fight or flight response. But fast forward several thousand years to today, and we have a world where we meet people all the time, we are exposed to stimuli all the time, and our emotional brain is still perceiving this as a potential danger. Not only that, we invent dangers for ourselves. So we spend a lot of time worrying about things that may or may not happen. So this fight and flight response is the fundamental biological basis of stress. But stress is an important part of what motivates us. So probably the originator of much of the research on stress, Hansel, he differentiated good and bad stress. And he described good stress as being eustress. So this is the kind of stress that's stimulating, it makes you more productive, and it's adaptive. It helps you change and evolve. Contrast that with distress, which is the bad stress, which is harmful, especially when it's chronic. It's the stress that doesn't serve any purpose. It simply creates a chronic response in you that wears down your biological and psychological system. But we should remind ourselves that stress cannot be avoided. It is part of life and it's indispensable. So I said earlier that one of the key parts of the knowledge that we have to develop is about ourselves, because stress doesn't happen sort of in a vacuum. It's happening to you, and stress is the great amplifier. One of the important parts of understanding how we both experience and stress, but also how we react to stress, is to understand our own personality. Some temperament types can be more vulnerable to certain types of stress. The graphic there in the corner will be familiar to some of you. That is the temperament cube from Dr. Robert Cloninger's work on the temperament character inventory, which we're going to mention in a moment. And that reminds us that depending on where we are on a spectrum of temperament traits, we can react differently to different stresses. And that's true of our character too, our character being that part of our personality that is a little bit more dependent on our values and our goals and our life experiences. It develops later than our temperament, and it helps modify and manage our temperament. So whatever strategies we're going to use to cope or adapt and to manage the stress that we perceive, we're going to have to pay attention to our temperament style and our character style, and we're going to need to create strategies that are highly personal to us. Having said that, stress does have a universal effect, right? I said it's a great amplifier. It makes our strengths often more evident, which is great, and that would be the case for eustress, right? It would bring out, cause us to bring out our adaptive abilities. But it can also make our weaknesses and vulnerabilities even more obvious, and we can all somewhat regress under stress. And indeed, the psychological definition of stress would be, any situation where we feel that we have the environment or the crisis or situation has exceeded our own ability to cope. So I mentioned the importance of understanding personality. This again is the model of personality that we use in the temperament character inventory, which is an important tool that is available to all PALM members as part of their well-being activities. Again, based on the work of Dr. Robert Cloninger during his tenure at Washington University in St. Louis, and we've used this understanding of personality extremely successfully in helping people to become more aware of what their particular needs are in terms of adapting and dealing with stress. So where is the best bang for your buck? You see that the model consists of these two major features of personality that give us both salience and meaning. So that on the one hand, we have the temperament. So the temperament is, almost akin to our animal instincts. So there are four major components of that: harm avoidance, novelty seeking, reward dependence, and persistence. And we can be anywhere on a spectrum of low to high in any one of these traits. Each of these traits will interact. So whether we could be high in harm avoidance and low in reward dependence, and that would create its own set of particular challenges. Likewise, with our character, there are three main pillars of character. Now, character, as I said earlier, tends to develop later in life. Temperament is very obvious from an early age. You can see the heritable aspect of it in that many of your, those of you who have kids, you will notice that your kids may have some of the same temperament as you do or your own parents did. Character is a little more different. It does have a heritable part to it, but it develops much later, usually around adolescence, when we start to develop self-awareness and we recognize that we have a relationship both with ourselves, which leads us to a sense of self-directedness, a self-responsibility for our own actions and our own lives. We have a relationship to those around us, to humanity in general, that we are a human within the human family, and that leads us to develop a sense of cooperativeness, our kindness and tolerance and sense of compassion for other people. But also that we are situated within this existence where we sense we are part of something much bigger. And that gives us a relationship to the universe as a whole, otherwise known as self-transcendence, our spirituality, our awareness of those things beyond the material reality. And between the character and the temperament, our self-awareness and our self-observation lead us to develop a narrative of our own identity. And so there is an interplay between this continually evolving sense of identity, along with our evolving character traits and our evolving ability to manage our temperament traits, which tend to be more consistent over our life cycle. So the temperament character inventory is a self-report questionnaire which allows you to gain some insight into this, and is an endless source of information when you're facing stressful situations. So those of you that have already done it, it's well worth pulling it out and keeping it handy, and it's well worth repeating it because certain aspects of it, of course, will change over time. The other thing to understand about stress is that the human nature is such that we tend to focus on negative things. So you will understand this from relationships, right? Where you can have a relationship where you feel like you've spent a lifetime of doing positive things and giving positive feedback and so on, and then you do something wrong, and it's that gets remembered. It's a very typical human quality. It's a very typical tendency of the human mind. And so it is with ourselves, that when we're under stress, we often find ourselves focusing on our weaknesses rather than our strengths. And the accumulation of multiple small disappointments, a variety of dissatisfactions, focus on our failings and shortcomings, and also the tendency, which is only increased these days, to compare ourselves with others and our imagined ideals. All of this leads us to these little crises that build up and build a sort of brick in the wall of a sort of prison of despair, where it often isn't the final straw that is the major cause of the stress. But when we step back and really look at it, we see that there's just been a series of disappointments and dissatisfactions that have not really been dealt with or processed in a healthy way. The other thing to understand about stress is that it is part of how we know we are adapting to the world around us. And we adapt continually because the environment that we're in changes continually. So we make these functional adjustments between ourselves and our environment. And that can be for a number of different reasons. But the strategies that you implement are going to create the structures within your own life that will and they will be dependent on the constraints of your own environment, but also of your own flexibility, which means both your body's plasticity and your mental flexibility. Now, when we don't adapt, when we adapt badly, the sort of friction or discordance that we experience can actually function as a source of inspiration. It can stimulate curiosity, exploration, creation. In other words, it wakes us up to the fact that something new needs to happen. And so the effect of stress in terms of the adaptive response can be to help us further realize ourselves in the world. We may reach a point in our life, and it often happens, in middle age, where we think we sort of basically know what it's all about. And it can become a shock to a lot of people to realize that there's still more to figure out. But that's often because many of the choices we've made have not been fully conscious choices. To go back to the consideration of our personality, the effect of our temperament is going to operate unconsciously a lot of the time. And we will often do things because it avoids the things that make us unhappy, or it draws us towards the things that bring us pleasure. And that can seriously influence a lot of our choices, which means that they're not necessarily choices that are made with a conscious, rational mind, and that occasionally that means we're going to hit the wall. And so this need to constantly adapt, because everything in us and in the world is constantly in motion, is a way of us maintaining our connection to our own participation in the world. So again, it's another way of saying that stress has a good part to it. If you're going through a stressful time, there is something to celebrate about that. Oops. Just a little special plug here for neuroplasticity. So we've mentioned it a couple of times already about the body's plasticity and our ability to adapt. Neuroplasticity is something that is of particular interest to us at Palm, and I have a particular interest in, and increasingly now in medicine in general, there is a recognition of the importance of neuroplasticity, although I think 10 years ago we were perhaps a little bit more on our own in this. But neuroplasticity really is the underpinning of our mental flexibility. So by neuroplasticity, of course, we mean the ability of the brain to rework itself. So instead of the brain being a fixed and immutable and immovable set of networks, it's actually a work in progress. Right? It's like a ship sailing on the ocean that constantly has to have pieces removed and replaced, and or like a road network in a city that constantly has to have roads dug up and rerouted. So the nervous system retains within it always this ability to change itself. But we can help that process, because as we get older, that tends to be less the case, for the obvious reason that there's less new under the sun when you're older. So if you think about an infant has to turn from a completely dependent bundle of flesh into a walking, talking, interactive human being. And the basics of that is achieved within the first 3 years of life, which is remarkable. I mean, it's it's just mind-blowing what the brain does from birth to age three or four. And what's happening at a neurological level is that millions of synapses are being broken and reconnected, broken and reconnected all the time, so that as the infant is interacting with their environment, so they can improve, they can create ever better and better adaptations. So it's really a kind of stress adaptation situation. It's just that it's all eustress, it's all good stress, it's all friction that is forcing the infant's brain to continue to grow and develop. Now, when you get to that's happening at a rate of about 32 million synapses a second during infancy, which is remarkable. You know, it's sort of like, you know, remember the old, those of you remember the old telephone exchanges, you know, like the episode of I Love Lucy, where she goes crazy trying to reconnect, trying to connect everybody. It's literally plugging and unplugging neuronal connections at a speed of millions per second. Now, when you get to my age, it's probably lucky if I'm having one of those connections made every minute or every hour. But the point is the potential remains there. And as we learn new things, as we experience new things, so we have the potential to keep this plasticity alive. Movement, the pictures that illustrate this slide illustrate movement. On the right, you see a picture of people in a class, which is a neuroplasticity class, which we developed for the Anthropedia Foundation's work on training wellbeing coaches. And the point about that is that through complex movement, using rhythm, using music, using spatial awareness, using proprioceptive awareness, counting, it's one of the easiest and most efficient ways to promote neuroplasticity. Likewise, dance, is a very effective way to promote neuroplasticity. And as I've just said, neuroplasticity underlines mental flexibility. Now, building on our work of the temperament character inventory that we just saw, we can actually look at some of the particular temperament and character traits that underline our mental resilience, our ability to adapt and to withstand change and challenge in life. And you can see from this resilience cube, you can see that the three most powerful factors, although not the only ones, are self-directedness, which is our ability to take responsibility, it's our ability to be resourceful and problem solving, and to see ourselves as the captain of our own ships, making decisions, taking actions in response to our life, as opposed to feeling like a victim. That, of course, is key, developing that, but also in our temperament, our level of harm avoidance can be key. The more we are able to assess risk, but also manage the inhibition that comes with that assessment. So can we assess risk, but can we also overcome any inhibition we have about taking risk? And likewise, persistence. Persistence is a dangerous weapon in the wrong hands. Persistence is that trait that allows us to keep going even when we don't experience any immediate gratification. Now, high persistence can be wonderful because you become hardworking, ambitious, and you don't want to give up. But in terms of our resilience and our flexibility, sometimes we have to know when to let go. Likewise, low persistence may allow us to be more laid back and be more willing to let go, but it doesn't allow us necessarily to know when we have to keep going and keep trying again. So flexibility within these particular traits is an important way in which we can maintain resilience in the face of challenge. Now, it's worth also dwelling for a moment on issues pertaining to our life cycle, because when I look at the people that will come and join the stress management program in Palm, you can see that it's often, for example, if it's younger people, it's often younger people who've just finished college and are a little bit lost finding their way in the world. Or if it's older people, it's often people who've just retired and feel a little bit lost. Or it's people who've reached the sort of middle-aged moment where, you know, the kids are leaving home, the job is sort of second nature, you can do it with your eyes closed, and the meaning of it all is coming into question. Whatever the particular crisis, life transitions are often some of the most stressful moments in our life. Our lives are obviously full of major events that mark these transitions from one situation to another. And they correspond often to very significant demands. So marriage, having a baby, starting school, moving, beginning a career, loss of close relationships, divorce, bereavement, retirement. Now, all of these events are inevitable. They involve positive and or negative changes and are a potential source of stress. The work of Havinghurst, he was a social scientist who looked at what are the typical sorts of challenges and demands that are made at different points in the life cycle. I've just selected a few here to contrast adolescence, early adulthood, and middle adulthood. And the thing to say here is that oftentimes in our culture today, we don't really respect and cultivate the differences that we face at different times of our life cycle. So you can see that, you know, the typical adolescent is learning how to accept their own body, dealing with their sexuality, acquiring the sorts of skills necessary to enter into, you know, civic life, developing values that will guide their behavior. Whereas in middle adulthood, those things are generally supposed to be settled, and that we're more concentrated on adjusting to the changes of aging, to the changes of our family structure as our children get older, maintaining our responsibilities. But it's often the case in our culture today that those differences in the life cycle get very blurred, and a lot of middle-aged people feel compelled to, you know, to be involved in really what are essentially adolescent preoccupations. You know, how do I look? You know, am I accepted? You know, what kind of person, you know, am I going to be? So there's been a lot of blurring of these lines, and this can often make these transitions even more complicated and more stressful, as people haven't got a clear idea of what they're leaving behind and what they're moving into. Again, important thing to become knowledgeable about. Similarly, Erik Erikson, the great sociologist, developed his own concept of the life cycle built around key dilemmas or conflicts at different parts of life. And again, you can see in adolescence, the 12 to 18-year-olds, identity versus role confusion was for him the key dilemma. So here it was about the adolescent really beginning to become self-aware and forming a sense of who are they, and, you know, how are they going to, what is their role going to be? How are they going to establish their own attitudes and values in the world? By middle age, however, we're talking about generativity versus stagnation. In other words, how do we manage to use our age and our position of some superiority over our children, at work, in order to produce the most good for the most people? Much more turned towards others, much more other-centric than adolescence. And again, this is sometimes forgotten in our culture. We tend to sort of regress back to a sort of adolescent concerns when we're faced with some of these more middle-aged life crises. Similarly, in old age, it's not about proving yourself or being able to, you know, be generative in terms of leading the family or leading the business. It's much more about being available to the other generations in terms of your wisdom and your reflection. It's much more about modeling that acceptance that comes with age and a lifetime of experiences. So it's really important to reflect on where we are in the life cycle and what really what really should be our priorities at any given time. So all of this to say that part of part of the knowledge we need to have is making an accurate assessment. And in general, life does rather follow the formulaic way in which sitcoms are created. In other words, they are character driven and situational. So the stressful nature of a situation depends on those two factors, the personal and the situational. So the personal factors will be the things that we have mentioned already, personality, but also our intellectual abilities, our motivational abilities, all things that, you know, we have a degree of input to. The situation, it may be more tricky. It's often stressors that are beyond our control. So examples of typical situational stresses would be the things we've mentioned: death of a loved one, job loss, divorce, family problems, debt, overwork, underwork, illness. It's interesting and important to note that although you know, we have such a work-oriented culture in the United States that, you know, most of us you know, are stressed because we feel overwhelmed. It is just as overwhelming to not have things to do. There's plenty of research showing how underemployment, not just unemployment, but underemployment builds stress in people, and the reasons are multifactorial, but it's an important one to recognize. It's also interesting to note that in the time that we're living now, this particular strange moment in time, there's quite a lot of underemployment, right? There's quite a lot of, you know, not having the same level of activity during our day. Also quite a lot of social isolation, struggling with debt or financial adjustments, illness, which is another very common stressor and cause of significant stress in people, family stresses, family relationship stresses, being stressed by the fear propagated by our 24-hour media culture and changes in our work and business structures. So this little invisible enemy that we are all worried about right now is actually a source of multiple situational stresses for us. You know, many of us are obviously very aware of this. Now, we said the situational stresses are sometimes things we can do something about, or sometimes, like COVID restrictions, something that we just can't do anything about. I mean, nobody's asking us, they're being imposed, we just have to follow them, right? But the personal situation is something that's much more under our control. And there are three very common situations that we come across when people present asking for help with stress management. Firstly, the issue of self-esteem. Do you believe that you have the resources to meet the challenge, or is everything a threat? Now, this pertains very much to our self-directedness, right? If we have been used to not taking responsibility, or if we've lived a life that's very prescriptive, it can come as quite a shock to us that we don't have the sense of resourcefulness that we thought we had. This often happens with, you know, a lot of the highly skilled professionals that I see, you know, doctors and lawyers and so on, who in their working life, they consider themselves extremely well adapted and very resilient and flexible. But of course, much of what they do is very prescriptive. And becoming a professional is very prescriptive. You know, you enter medical school, you do what you're told, you get out the other end, and you do your business. And that doesn't work for all aspects of our life. Many aspects of our life, you know, what do you want to do with your life? How do you want to live your life? Where do you want to live your life? How are you going to structure your relationships and your work? Those things do not necessarily follow such an easy prescriptive path. And it's then that we realize that while we might feel resourceful in one area, we might not be as resourceful in another. The common response to that is to just ignore the area that you're not resourceful in and concentrate on the one that you are, which sets up a sort of cycle of avoidance that has its own problems. Second very common personal issue is motivation. So there's a sort of paradox here, because if the situation is important to you, well, you're going to perceive it as very stressful because, you know, it really matters. But you're also hopefully going to find the energy to tackle it. On the other hand, there are some situations that become extremely stressful because we just can't get up the motivation. And sometimes that's simply because we don't care. And in that case, it's often important to take a step back and say, why has this become an important question for you? Is it an important question, or is it simply that you have sleepwalked into a situation which at the end of the day is not what you are about and not a major priority for you? The third and really classic barrier to understanding how to approach stress management is the number of erroneous belief systems that we carry around with us, often without even knowing it. So one way to capture that might be in the statement, I desire above all to have a comfortable and pleasurable life. So the conditions under which I live must be completely easy, convenient, and enjoyable. Well, good luck with that one. That's obviously not realistic. Yes, comfort and pleasure is nice, right? Most of us watching this webinar live lives that really have a high level of comfort and pleasure. We're not waking up on the rocky, hard, cold floor of a cave, wondering, if we'll ever have another meal. No, we wake up in soft, warm cotton beds with the sunlight coming through the window. We can smell the coffee coming up from the kitchen below. I mean, before we've even got out of bed, we've had several pleasurable experiences. And of course, as we've said before, if life was simply comfortable and pleasurable, we wouldn't evolve. We wouldn't actually grow. So although there is an obvious problem with this statement, it's surprising how many people actually sign up to this belief. It's surprising how many people who, until you challenge them, really do think that anything that disrupts the comfort and pleasure of their life is a disaster or a failure, where in fact it's just life. So erroneous belief systems are so important, let's do another one. I expect to have psychological and physical security, so I must assess and anticipate every possible danger or risk before I commit to any changes in my life. All right, good luck. It's not going to work, right? There are risks inherent in everything we do. You can't crawl back into the womb. You're here now. You can only make the best that you can of it. You can't see the future. You can only make decisions based on the best available information that you have to hand at the moment. And to not take action simply because you cannot anticipate or control every risk is to create problems in and of itself. No choice is a choice. And so again, when you look at it, when you say it like that, it's obviously crazy. It doesn't make sense. It isn't compatible with a fluid life. But it's surprising how many of us unconsciously cling to this belief. All right, I'm on a roll, so let's do one more. I expect to be stimulated and entertained all the time, so I must never be bored or have to wait long for anything. Well, that's probably one that you see amongst younger generations. Again, this isn't realistic, right? Apart from anything else, solitude, silence, moments of non-productivity and non-entertainment are essential parts of the human experience. Mozart didn't write his symphonies on a bus chatting to a friend. He shut himself away for long periods of time. Anything of any value that was created by humankind involved some amount of patience, some amount of humility, some amount of solitude, and it is not realistic to think otherwise. Otherwise, you're just going to be basically living a very superficial life. All right, one final one, because I can't help myself. I want everyone I meet to like me, or I must never disappoint anyone or ever say no, and I must always put a smile on their face. Again, When I put it like that, it sounds hideous, right? Who would want to live their life like that? But it's remarkable the number of people who, when push comes to shove, that is actually the rigid and unmovable expectation that they have. Everybody must like them. And no, there must never be any disappointed or sad faces. And you must never say no. It doesn't work. It's not compatible. It is going to lead to an enormous amount of stress. We can only be as honest and have as much integrity and compassion as we can. We will ultimately disappoint some people. And sometimes saying no, of course, is the kind thing to do. All right, so we're getting the idea that making an assessment of both the situational but also the personal characteristics of our stressful life crisis is actually a little bit, take us into a little bit of a deeper place than we might have first thought, and open up a lot of interesting questions. Likewise, when we start to develop strategies, we're going to have to personalize them. So new situations or a life crisis, we may have to abandon our usual strategies. And this is hard for a lot of people. Again, this requires a lot of mental flexibility and neuroplasticity. Our usual way of coping is challenged because it no longer allows us to adapt. We're going to have to take risks, seek new solutions, and adopt or invent new strategies. Many people resist this. Many people will, particularly later in life, will say, well, I've been so successful doing it this way my whole life, which may be true. But if it no longer is applicable to the situation before you, then there is really no alternative but to create a new strategy. And having created that new strategy, even at later stages of our life, we're going to find ourselves having to take a leap of faith, having to dive in, take risks, and expose ourselves to new situations and new phenomena, which may mean letting go of our current role. It may mean letting go of our current standing or position and allowing ourselves to adopt a new role and a new standing. We can sort of organize all these personal strategies into 4 basic groups. So we have coping strategies. These are very important ways in which we help people with stress management. So these are all the individualized ways we have of managing the current situation, building on our strengths, building on some of our inherent coping abilities. We have identity strategies, which are ways in which we find our place in the world. So this may be important, for example, when entering retirement, when we have to, really rewrite the narrative of who we are and what our place is. Similarly, social positioning strategies where we can redefine our role, create new networks, create new social outlets and avenues of recognition and meaning. And finally, the very simple project strategies where we simply come up with things to do that will help us move forward. Every step we take forward allows us to see things from a different perspective. Every problem has a loophole. That's guaranteed. It's written into the code. Every problem will have a loophole. The issue is whether we can find it or not. Just an extra word on coping strategies, since that's probably the most common way we help people. So they can be at an individual level, they can be at a more social level, or they can be at a more complex psychological level. Individually, it will be about our self-effectiveness, our efficacy, our optimism, endurance, or strength, our sense of coherence, and our internal locus of control. Are we the ones taking action, taking decisions? That will be indicated very nicely by your TCI level of self-directedness. So that will point to the fact of whether there's greater bang for your buck in focusing on this particular coping strategy and developing it. Similarly, the social strategies are around our network of friends and family, our spouse, and how we are connected, recognizing that this is an essential part of how we develop individually and overcome stress individually. I often point out when I'm told, well, I'm a self-made man. I say, well, that's interesting. Did you build the school that you were educated in? Did you weave the clothes that you were wearing? Did you train the teachers that taught you? And of course, I mean, that's ridiculous, and I know I know that's not true. But the point I'm making is that none of us are self-made. Ultimately, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. We're all great. We all benefited from the people that taught us, the people that built the school that we were taught in, the people that make the clothes. There are people around the world right now to which we are all immediately and directly connected because of the things that we are using to overcome the stresses and challenges of our life. And our TCI level of cooperativeness will give us an idea of to what extent we are able to really benefit from those strategies, or whether we need to work on that. And finally, the complex psychological resources that we find in us. The things like the deeper motivations, this ability to be open and flexible, the awareness we have of the bigger picture, and the ability we have to develop perspective. And this is measured very nicely by the TCI character trait of self-transcendence. Again, it's critical that all three of these strategies are available to us, and the TCI will help us see which ones we might need to focus on more, or which ones we can use and rely on more. So coping is very closely related to the healthy development of character, which is continuous throughout our lives. Oops. Now, just a little sidebar here about compulsive behaviors and addiction. And the reason I want to just mention this in particular is because it's such a common barrier to people dealing with stress, and often ends up being a sort of second level of stress that, unless it's dealt with, doesn't allow you to get to the root stresses. So we place ourselves in a particular vicious cycle when we have either compulsive behaviors or an addiction, because the shadow of our desire to stop these, what we perceive as bad habits, hangs over us all the time that we're doing them. And the desire to do them hangs over us all the time that we're not. And so it's really essential, if we're going to learn and face our stresses, that we face up to this cycle and we figure out a way to get out of it. Because anything that creates unhealthy dependence is not a healthy strategy. One of the things that we encourage through our stress management interventions is helping people to stand on their own 2 feet. It's not about becoming dependent, but at the same time, recognizing that by relying on each other, we are all interdependent, and we can benefit from each other. But whether it's alcohol, whether it's, just spending 4 hours a night watching YouTube clips of cats, or whatever it is that's become a sort of avoidant or compulsive behavior, step one is to recognize it. Step one is to accept it and see it for what it is. It doesn't help to dwell on why it's wrong, because most people will know that. It does help, however, to dwell on why you are under the impression that it is useful or helpful, or will somehow help move things along for you, rather than create this avoidant cycle of dependence. So if that has become a sort of issue in your stress management, or if that exists or pre-exists your particular crisis, it's something that's going to have to be faced. And it's actually often a reason why people put off dealing with stressful situations, because they instinctively know that they're going to have to get out of this cycle. But it's very odd, really, when you think that it's avoided, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is dropping something that is only getting in your way. Okay, well, that's a whole nother seminar in itself, but let's just return for a moment to what we said earlier about personality. All of these personal factors that we've talked about are really manageable if you have knowledge. So the knowledge here is of yourself. The Anthropedia Foundation's well-being curriculum is called Know Yourself. The inscription above the entrance to the temple at Delphi invited people to know thyself. The important knowledge here that is key is of your particular strategies, your particular habits of learning, your particular meaning and salience that you get out of life, all of which can be revealed to us by a deeper understanding of our own personality, the identity narrative that we have created from the feedback that we have received as a result of that, and recognizing that none of this is fixed in stone. This is all a work in progress. Similarly, there's fascinating work, again, from the lab of Dr. Cloninger, in these higher functions that help us develop, and we've touched on some of these. So at a more material level, we see that the plasticity of the body is key. Developing neuroplasticity, developing flexibility of our physiological responses is key to us developing more flexible responses in terms of our mental and physical functioning, and also developing new functions, developing new things that we're able to do and learn. And all of this is given salience and meaning by developing these overarching virtues. You know, we touched on them earlier: patience and humility. So without an understanding of yourself, you may reach for solutions of which you know little, to fix problems of which you know less, in a person, in an individual, yourself, of whom you may know almost nothing. We have many resources we can develop, many of which are, if not hidden from us, we haven't fully accepted the potential that we each have. We touched on some of them: patience, humility, wisdom, compassion, to name but a few. But there are many more ways in which our higher functions can develop, and our stresses can become to seem much more manageable. At the risk of sounding sort of like a know-it-all, I'll let you know that that quote is a paraphrase from one of my favorite Voltaire quotes, which is, "Doctors are men who prescribe medicines of which they know little, to cure diseases of which they know less, in human beings of whom they know nothing." So there's a bit of humility for me right there. But it's true, right? And in terms of stress management, it also reminds us the importance of, you know, if you're waiting for the bus to turn up, it might not come, right? There may not be a silver bullet to your problem. Many of the so-called silver bullets that are prescribed by experts only lead to a new set of problems. Doctors, in their wisdom, have often been wrong, and often it doesn't take too long to prove just how wrong they are. But it does mean that, you know, really we're all the physician to ourselves in these matters. You know, there is no other way than to take individual responsibility and to try as much as possible to exercise, you know, the intelligence that you can, given the information available to you. All right, so know yourself. So on a practical level, all of this assessment and strategies is going to help you to build a toolkit. You're going to have things that you can do that can help you to manage stress. If we look at this in terms of the body, we can see that there are many things we can do. And this is the reason why starting with the body is really key. Exercise, of course, we know that it helps stimulate the good hormones, the feel-good hormones. So for all the stress-promoting hormones we have that'll make you fight or flee, there are anti-stress hormones that help you to relax. Exercise can help stimulate them. Exercise can help balance the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight nervous system. Exercise can promote neuroplasticity. Exercise can simply put a smile on your face. It can help you to develop breathing regularity, and it puts you into a state of bodily awareness, which is key because your body is telling you so much information about why you're stressed, the level of your stress, where your stress is coming from, which most of us have just ignored for most of our lives. We have learned to focus on our minds at the expense of awareness of our bodies. Particular types of bodily exercises like cardiac coherence, psychophysiological coherence, which is taught very nicely at Palm. It's a technique which we use a lot. in which you will have a form of biofeedback to allow you to use simple breathing techniques to regulate the variability in your heart rate and therefore send messages of calm to your nervous system. The heart has a nervous system of its own which sends information to the brain. It is a sensing organ. It is not just a muscular pump. And practicing cardiac coherence is a very powerful way to help calm the autonomic nervous system. We've touched on neuroplasticity already, self-evident, the benefits that that brings to stress management. Diet is key. Vitamin and mineral supplements. We live in a world where we are toxified daily by pollutants, and the common pathway of toxic damage and stress damage is that, at a physical level, is that of oxidative stress. And vitamins and minerals are our most powerful antioxidants. We don't, unfortunately, get enough from our diets these days, even if we eat a healthy diet, because of the lack of micronutrients in the food that we're eating now. It's prematurely harvested. It's grown in soil that's polluted and devoid of minerals. And well, let's not depress ourselves too much. All that to say, vitamins and minerals are a key part of your toolkit. Sleep hygiene. This is something that I obviously talk about in pretty much everything I ever say. Sleep is that mysterious and wondrous medicine that restores all kinds of obvious and invisible functions every night. And it's a remarkable number of people who will complain of not sleeping well, but when they're really pinned down, their sleep hygiene is terrible. No screens, no stimulants, no excitement right before bed, but rather calming routines, reading, music, and so on. Detoxification, we sort of touched on this, mentioning vitamins and minerals, but we are, our ability to deal with stress is going to be undermined by the amount of toxins that we consume. That's a matter of our lifestyle and diets, but we can do something about it. There are natural treatments available at Palm: the biomat, the infrared sauna, the pulsed electromagnetic magnetic frequency mats. These are natural ways of restoring us to a natural state of calmness and relaxation. Time in nature is a good way to do that for ourselves. And we have to recognize that there is a state of true relaxation that we've forgotten. If we look back at the evolution of our biological systems, we evolved in a time when, once we had captured our food and picked our food and made sure our dwelling place was still standing, we would have laid down in a field and our body would have gone into a total state of physiological relaxation. There was no sort of thinking about all the emails we hadn't answered and whether we should organize, Thanksgiving. And, this sort of thing just didn't, this is a modern state of affairs, and we have lost the ability to reach this very particular state called relaxation. There was a study done recently where they asked people to name their favorite ways to relax. And it was full of things like read a good book, watch Netflix, have a glass of wine, all things that, I'm not going to say aren't enjoyable and pleasurable and can be done. But that's not relaxation. That's recreation, distraction. It's not relaxation. Relaxation is a physiological state where everything just goes on standby. And it's not a simple neutral state. During those states, the body is extremely busy repairing, preparing, reorganizing. And so it's essential that we learn how to relax and learn what relaxation is. Let's just briefly look at the mind as well. Well, the mind, as we've seen, building self-directedness allows us to take action. Action is key. Action is key. So in taking action, we'll need to sort of think about what our objectives are. We'll need to think about our overarching goals. We need to look for ways to find accountability so that we are held accountable to our actions. How many people suffer stress simply because they have the intention to do what they know needs to be done, but they never do it? Self-actualization comes from taking these steps, taking responsibility, letting go. That's a whole nother seminar in itself, but letting go is essential in this process. You know, we saw earlier about how we're going to need to admit that our old strategies are out of date, and we need to dive in and trust some new ways of doing things. You know, this is holding on. This is letting go. This is talking about letting go. This is debating letting go. This is talking to your psychiatrist about letting go. You know, letting your therapist know that you'd like to let go. Only that is letting go. So understanding about letting go and realizing that, again, in everyday life, there are lots of little ways in which we can learn to let go. It's not a great epiphany. It's every day. There is something you can let go of. There's something that you are obsessing about and you can let go. Emotional intelligence, I've talked about this a lot in the past. Again, it's a seminar in itself, but learning to regulate our emotions, not repress them, but rather to understand them and manage them. Mental detoxification. If you are watching CNN round the clock, if that's on in the background all day long, please turn it off, or whichever channel. It's not about which channel, it's about we don't need to pollute our minds with lots of information that is not actually going to help us necessarily cope because we can't do anything about it. Not polluting our minds with mentally toxifying information and ideas. And we've said quite a lot about the temperament character inventory, but it's an extremely useful tool. And if you haven't taken it and you're a Palm member, please do avail yourself of that opportunity. Things we might consider more of the soul rather than the mind or the body are the reflective things, the perspective and transcendence that we can gain from giving ourselves time to meditate and giving ourselves time to reflect on what's important, valuing our relationships. Life isn't all about productivity. You know, drop some of our rigid expectations, you know, maybe waste time, you know, with people that we love. Be other focused. We mentioned this earlier. It's an extremely important way to turn ourselves away from our own preoccupations and look outward and therefore gain perspective and build community, build connections with like-minded people. Okay, I realize I'm hopelessly over time, so I'm going to draw this to a close. All right, so let's just finish up by saying, well, what are these secrets of stress management? Well, I told you at the beginning, start with the body. The emotional brain is the body, and neuroplasticity underpins all our mental flexibility. Relaxation is a unique and vital physiological state. So whenever we're under stress, you know, and we all instinctively know this, right? When you're acutely stressed, what do? You try to breathe. You know, you try to deeply breathe because it starts with the body. It starts with the body because oxidative stress is a key universal pathway of the effects of stress. And nutrition, in particular, making sure we have adequate micronutrients is going to be key in that. And many of the tools that we've just touched upon are all body activities. So the cardiac coherence, breathing techniques, meditations, exercise, neuroplasticity, dance, and so on. Knowledge is key. Well, I think hopefully we've covered this one. You know, there's a lot more to know about yourself. You need to learn to build on your strengths, adapt to your vulnerabilities, develop strategies, rediscover your creativity, your ability for imagination and play. In other words, know yourself. Don't fall into the trap of assuming you've figured out what's wrong with the situation, what is the problem, and what needs to be done, when there may be a need to fundamentally understand the components of both you and the situation. Small changes build big benefits. By taking responsibility, working on our self-actualization, being accountable. Remember that these little habits, these good habits, are just as easy to break and to make as good habits, as bad habits. It's the same story. You know, there was a time in all of our lives when our parents would stand over us and say, have you brushed your teeth? And you say, yes, 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 when you hadn't. And it would be just a fight every night. And those of you who've got kids will know that you go through that with kids. But do you think now about how much energy and time it takes to brush your teeth? No, I mean, it's just a habit. You just do it and you benefit from it. And so self-actualization is about making these small adjustments and small steps to inculcate these good habits. Little acts of letting go, little acts of kindness. And all of this leads to conscious goal-oriented action, combined with a little reflection on the benefits that we're getting, on the outcome, that create these small acts of hope. And every one of these little acts of hope that we can do 20, 30 times a day is a brick in a palace of hope rather than that prison of despair. Okay, well, before we finish, let's just have a little word from our sponsors. Let's talk about the PALM approach, the PALM Stress Management Program. It's a very intense program. It uses a lot of the concepts that I've just been through, and it puts them into a program that is several hours a day over a number of weeks. And the point for that is to disrupt the stagnation and the inertia. You know, many people will come to me with a lot of stress, and I'll ask them what they want to do, and they'll say, well, do you have a book you could recommend? Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with reading books, but I would rather that you take action. It's a team approach, so you're immediately connected to a community of people who are going to have different viewpoints and are going to give different perspectives, but also be able to see you through different eyes, so we can make a very wide-ranging assessment very quickly. We're going to touch on all different aspects of the body, thought, and souls. We're going to get you out of your comfort zone. We're going to cultivate you to make objectives and set your own goals. It's going to be personality focused. We've already seen that the TCI is enormously helpful. Depression and anxiety and stress happen in whole people, and how you respond is what matters. We're going to encourage action and accountability, and we're going to integrate all this by having a team that meets regularly to discuss your progress and create a consistent, coordinated approach. So there's going to be multiple members of this team, representatives of counseling, bodywork, fitness, diet, nutrition, coaching, creativity, and art, as well as the more conventional medical and psychiatric input. What a handsome looking team. I mean, that's reason enough to do the program, right? I think I might be letting the side down a bit though. And just to say that in this time of COVID, the program is now virtual for the time being. It's initially a 4-week commitment, but after that, you then extend it in ways that are right for you. So you create a bespoke program. And if you're interested, if you're a member of PALM and you're interested, speak with your navigator. If you're a non-member and you'd like to do the program, which is available to non-members, then you should call the program coordinator, whose name is Sarah Lewis, and she'd be happy to give you information. Okay, well, I'm sorry I've gone so over time. Let me just finish by giving one of my favorite quotes from Montaigne. A man who fears suffering is already suffering from what he fears. Stress can seem overwhelming. Stress can leave you paralyzed and not knowing which way to turn. But every step that you take through the fog and through the uncertainty puts you a little bit into a different state of perspective. And slowly, as you walk the path is revealed to you. With the help of the people around you, with the help of people who have knowledge and skills that can aid your journey, there's plenty that can be done. So I hope that this information is helpful. I look forward to being able to help some of you directly through our stress management program. Do feel free to get in touch either with Sarah, who's the program coordinator, if you want information about the concrete logistics of the program, or I am happy to also answer some questions about how the program might be suited to you in these challenging times, and hope that maybe we will all come out of this with more flexibility, and that perhaps that this will be character forming for many of us, and that we will be better models for our children, and that something good will come out of the stressful situation that we all find ourselves in now. Good luck, everybody, and hope to see you soon.